The tyranny of the intentional silence. You are waiting for sleep. You are searching for rest. But the greatest battles for mental sovereignty are fought not in the daylight chaos, but in the oppressive quiet of midnight. We promise an insight that the illusion of control is never more visible than in the moments when you are desperately trying to relinquish it. Close your eyes, but keep your consciousness open. This journey isn't designed to make you sleep, but to awaken you to the intricate machinery that attempts to govern your inner world while your defenses are down. We are going to explore the grand theater of the mind, the place where decisions are made not by logic, but by the relentless refusal of silence. The question is, if control is an illusion, why do we feel such overwhelming failure when we cannot simply choose to stop thinking? The silence you currently inhabit, the hush between the last email checked and the first dream forming, we call this the tyranny of the intentional silence. This is not the silence of nature, nor the accidental lull in a busy street. This is the strategic silence you construct around yourself, hoping to create a void vast enough to swallow your daytime worries. Yet, why is it when the world outside finally ceases its clamor, that the world inside begins its most furious performance? This silence, born of intention, often becomes our greatest psychological tormentor. Imagine your consciousness as a sprawling, poorly managed library. All day, the doors were open, and the noise from the streets, the distractions, the input, the television, the scrolling feeds, drowned out the chaos within. But now, you have locked the external doors. You have extinguished the streetlights of external stimuli. You have demanded absolute, unconditional quiet. What happens? The librarians, the curators of memory, anxiety, and future possibility, realizing they are finally unobserved and unchecked, begin to shout over one another. This previously ignored internal conversation accelerates into a riot. The tyranny operates on a simple, cruel principle. The mind cannot tolerate a vacuum, and when you remove external input, it defaults instantly to recycling internal processing. You instruct your brain with the firm authority of a drill sergeant: be quiet, stop thinking, achieve stillness. But in that very command, you have provided a new, demanding job: the monitoring of quietness. You are dedicating high-level cognitive function to the task of non-thought. This is the ultimate existential paradox of trying to fall asleep. If you are successfully not thinking, how do you know you are succeeding? The act of checking verifies the failure. The moment you confirm, I am calm, you have generated a thought, restarting the entire motor of anxiety. The intentional silence turns the simple desire for rest into an Olympic event of mental control. You are attempting to control the uncontrollable, to capture the flow of consciousness by sheer willpower, and in doing so, you are actively manufacturing the noise you sought to avoid. And this is where the tyranny tightens its grip. The silence you hoped would be restorative becomes the stage for the performance of unprocessed anxiety. Your mind, which has been dutifully managing the superficial demands of the day, the appointments, the calls, the polite small talk, the filtered online persona, now drags forward the deep foundational uncertainties you successfully deflected at 3 p.m. It is here, in the enforced quiet, that you realize the critical difference between being silent and being still. You can shut off the lights, but you cannot shut off the reactor. The mind, in its intentional silence, reveals its true nature. It is not a tool awaiting your command. It is an environment that merely reflects the cumulative noise of your waking life. We become aware of the sheer, terrifying volume of our internal data stream, a volume we spend all day distracting ourselves from. We fear the silence because the silence offers pure, undistracted mirroring. It forces us to confront the fact that we are not the benevolent dictator of our thoughts, but rather a resident in a very crowded, noisy apartment building where all the neighbors decided to throw simultaneous parties the moment we requested quiet. We crave control, but the mind's true nature, when stripped of input, is anarchic flow. The philosophical shift required is profound, perhaps even terrifying. We must move from attempting to dominate the silence to simply observing the noise. The intentional silence only breeds tyranny because control is the objective. When you drop the pretense of control, when you stop checking if you are calm, the nature of the noise changes. It doesn't disappear, it simply ceases to demand a high-effort response. The tyranny resides not in the noise itself, but in the expectation that you should have the power to stop it. And as you lie there listening to the echoing insistence of your own unresolved narratives, remember this: the ultimate silence you seek is not the absence of sound, but the complete surrender to the presence of the self. The quiet mind is not a mind without thoughts. It is a mind that no longer fights the current of the thoughts it already has. The looming architectures of unmade decisions. You know this feeling, that subtle, high-frequency anxiety that creeps in the moment you cease productive labor, whispering about the intersection you failed to turn at 5 years ago, or the job offer you declined a decade prior. The silence of the night is not empty. It is filled with the echo chamber of alternate realities. What if everything hinged on that precise moment of hesitation, or that brief, uncharacteristic burst of courage? The mind, seeking stillness, finds only an exhaustive accounting. This is the cognitive mechanism we call the architecture of contingency. It is the mental project manager that, once the lights are out and the body is still, insists on auditing the past to guarantee the safety of the present. It isn't merely regret, which is an emotional response to a concrete error. This is far more abstract. It is the systematic, meticulous construction of parallel timelines, built solely from the materials of what if and if only. We don't build these structures to admire them. We build them to judge them, to meticulously prove that the path we are currently on, this single, heavy, certain line, was and remains the correct one. Picture your mind as an infinite mirrored skyscraper. Every floor above you represents a fully realized life based on a critical discarded choice. A different career track, a different geographical location, a different partner who waited in the wings. You stand perpetually in the lobby, staring up at the vertigo-inducing heights. You know, intellectually, that you can never step into those elevators. Those realities are locked. Yet, the sheer, unimaginable weight of those upper floors presses down on your ceiling, making the current floor you inhabit feel compressed and fragile. This pressure is the illusion of control applied retrospectively. The conflict inherent in this architectural endeavor is the friction between the initial, exhilarating freedom of choice and the resulting psychological paralysis of accountability. We believe we are exercising control over the outcome by meticulously reviewing the inputs. We think if I can just prove path B was disastrous, then path A is secure. But this intense retrospective review actually reduces your present control. By obsessively dedicating mental resources to validating your current life by meticulously destroying the hypothetical lives you could have led, you consume the vital energy needed simply to walk the path you are on right now. The profound paradox is that seeking definitive assurance through retrospective analysis guarantees future exhaustion. The architecture of contingency manifests itself in small, sharp moments when you are alone. It is the late-night job search query you run on a field you left years ago, the highly emotional text you draft and immediately delete, the sudden, irrational urge to reorganize your finances or your archival photos at 3 a.m. These are not practical tasks. They are ritualistic sacrifices offered to the god of future regret, hoping to preemptively buy immunity from criticism. You are busy patching the structural faults and phantom bridges that collapsed years ago. By cataloging the exhaustive reasons why the roads not taken were ultimately inferior, impossible, or destructive, you achieve a temporary, brittle form of psychological control. You reinforce the current reality, but this reinforcement creates an unhealthy rigidity. You become trapped in a defensive crouch, perpetually guarding a decision instead of living its consequences freely. You are not celebrating the life you built. You are merely defending the territory you claimed. This internal defense mechanism keeps you alert, tense, and unable to yield to the unconscious. Sleep cannot commence when you are too busy maintaining the structural integrity of the phantom worlds you chose not to inhabit. Release the blueprints. You are attempting to manage and control an outcome that has already dissolved into the irreversible, indifferent dust of the past. The unmade decisions cannot harm you. They are shadows without substance. Only the control you refuse to relinquish now has the power to keep you awake. Rest. Freedom found in complete powerlessness. You've been lying here in the quiet, fighting the exhaustion. Not the physical exhaustion of the day, but the mental exhaustion of trying to manage the space between your ears. You are attempting to impose order on a stream of consciousness that defies all deadlines and schedules. You are trying to edit the day you just lived, or pre-write the scripts for the day that hasn't arrived. You believe that if you just gripped the reins tighter, if you just exerted slightly more willpower, your mind would finally obey and grant you the stillness necessary for rest. This is where we encounter the paradox of radical acceptance. The freedom you seek is not achieved through successful control, but through complete relinquishing of the attempt. The moment you acknowledge the unassailable boundary of your influence, the things you simply cannot force, you cease to suffer from the failure of impossible exertion. Powerlessness is not defeat. It is a neutral state, a profound act of psychological efficiency. We are conditioned to view competence as control. If something is broken, we fix it. If something is disordered, we organize it. If a thought is disruptive, we attempt to silence it. But here, waiting for the dark to claim you, you discover the hard truth. Consciousness is not a machine that answers to a command prompt. It is a vast, self-generating ecosystem, and your attempts to manually regulate its climate only create secondary, more intense storms. Imagine a boat caught in the deep ocean, far beyond the sight of land, battered by a relentless, indifferent current. As the captain, your first instinct is to steer, to fight the momentum, to correct the trajectory mile by costly mile. You spend all your energy bracing against the unavoidable reality of the sea. But what if you stop steering entirely? What if you dropped the tiller and allowed the boat to simply become a buoyant object subject to the laws of physics and water? The danger doesn't disappear, but the agonizing friction of the struggle immediately evaporates. The energy you conserve in that single moment of surrender is the energy that allows you to simply exist within the storm. The suffering we experience in the dark is rarely caused by the initial chaotic thought, the sudden memory, the anxious projection. The real suffering is the judgment of that thought, followed by the exhausting effort to subdue, replace, or rationalize it. This creates a relentless internal double bind. You try to control the anxiety about not sleeping, and that failure generates more anxiety, which you then try to control. You are endlessly policing an entity you can neither jail nor evict. We carry this illusion of control into every corner of modern life. We quantify our productivity, optimize our health metrics, and attempt to algorithmically manage our emotional stability. We treat existence as a project management task, believing that total preparation negates the possibility of surprise or discomfort. But when the light turns off and the external stimuli disappear, we are forced back into the raw, unedited space of the self. We realize that the most powerful forces, grief, inspiration, time, and unconscious thought, are fundamentally ungovernable. This acknowledgement of radical powerlessness is the deepest form of rest. When you cease fighting the fact that you are awake, you interrupt the loop of secondary suffering. You stop treating the moment as an emergency requiring intervention. Your tense body, having been holding the metaphorical rudder for hours, finally recognizes that the rudder has no purchase here. The shoulders drop, the jaw unlocks, the muscles of the eye, exhausted from scanning the horizon for external threats, simply go soft. There is profound relief in the realization, I was never truly in charge here. That realization is not defeat, but a colossal release of obligation. All the energy previously directed toward policing the present moment is now available for genuine, unforced calm. You stop trying to manipulate the necessary conditions for sleep, and instead, you simply allow the natural, essential mechanism of surrender to take over. Let the final paradox settle deeply into your bone marrow. The absolute, unedited freedom you crave, the quiet, effortless peace, is found not in seizing control of this moment, but in letting this moment completely seize you. Surrender is not the opposite of competence. It is the final, essential prerequisite for rest. Few arrive here awake. Leave your mark with a like. It helps this reflection reach others who seek truth before sleep. Surrender that cannot be willed. The great irony of the hour before sleep is that it requires you to execute the one action that cannot be executed, the surrender of control. This is the core dilemma, the cognitive fingerprint of the insomniac, and the existential truth we face the moment the lights go out. We call this phenomenon the surrender that cannot be willed. You are lying there, commanding your nervous system to stand down, insisting that your thoughts cease their relentless patrol. You issue orders to your body: relax, slow down, let go. But the moment surrender becomes an agenda item, a goal with a deadline attached, it ceases to be surrender. It transforms into yet another high-stakes task that you are failing. Why is the most necessary rest the most fiercely guarded, insurmountable gate? To understand this operational contradiction, consider the nature of willing. Willing is the function of the conscious executive mind. It is the tool used for solving equations, planning the week, and engaging effort. Surrender, conversely, is the cessation of executive function. It is the dismantling of the internal manager, the dropping of the project brief. To will yourself to surrender is to assign the task of dismantling the manager to the manager. It creates an infinite self-canceling loop of effort. You are trying to use the mechanism of control to achieve non-control, and the mechanism cannot compute its own destruction. Imagine trying to catch silence. You open your hands, poised, ready to grasp the soundless moment. But the very act of preparing your hands, the tension in your wrist, the mental focus, is an effort that prevents true stillness from landing. The harder you try to secure the silence, the more aware you become of the rustling of the sheets, the pulse throbbing in your neck, and the noisy, frantic urgency of your own attempt. The action of willing peace generates the friction of tension. This is the psychological finger trap. You desperately want to slide out, but every force you apply to exit only tightens the weave around your fingers. You are caught between the conscious desire for rest and the subconscious fear of losing the structural integrity of your vigilance. The mind perceives a vacuum of control as danger. If it lets go, who will be watching? Even if what needs watching is just the ceiling fan, the control center cannot authorize its own shutdown. We try to combat this internal friction by inventing rituals of release, counting breaths, visualizing waterfalls, repeating mantras. These are excellent decoys, strategic distraction techniques designed to occupy the executive mind just long enough for it to become bored and wander away. They are not the surrender itself. They are the stage props for a necessary disappearing act. The surrender is not found in the perfect execution of the ritual, but in the microsecond when you forget you were trying to execute it at all. This paradox transcends the bedroom and applies to every area where we demand organic outcomes through forced effort. We try to force happiness, force creativity, or force the letting go of a painful memory. We treat emotional processing like a logistical problem that must be solved by willpower. But true healing, true rest, and true insight are not achieved. They are allowed. They are states of reception, not production. The moment you recognize that effort is the barrier, something subtle shifts. You stop struggling with the finger trap and start studying the weave. The profound impact is realizing that you do not need a blueprint for peace. You only need to stop building walls against it. When you realize you cannot will yourself to surrender, the tension begins to dissipate, not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it the energy of your intention. You let the trying dissolve. The resistance to the inability to surrender is the final surrender. So lie there now, not attempting to let go, but simply noticing the body that is refusing to let go. Do not fight the vigilance. Allow it to be the final sound in the quiet room. The true rest comes not when you finally achieve surrender, but when you realize surrender was never something to be achieved. It was simply the space left behind when the striving finally grew tired of its own noise. The insurgent territory of the inner monologue. The moment your head hits the pillow is the moment your conscious governing self is overthrown. We enter the insurgent territory of the inner monologue, a space not designed for peace, but for retroactive argumentation, infinite contingency planning, and the meticulous auditing of past social faux pas. What is it about this nightly surrender that triggers such intellectual resistance? You crave the quiet void, the promised relief of unconsciousness, yet the mind insists on hosting an unscheduled mandatory tribunal centered entirely around your accumulated mistakes and future anxieties. This territory, this echoing chamber of the self, feels intimately yours, but is it truly under your command? Or are you merely the landlord of a building full of demanding tenants you cannot evict? Philosophically, the inner monologue is often presented as the signature of consciousness, the private script running perpetually beneath the surface of experience. But we rarely acknowledge its biological mechanism. It arises primarily from the brain's default mode network, DMN, a sprawling system that activates precisely when you stop focusing on the external world. When the lights go out and deliberate action ceases, this network lights up, beginning its relentless, autonomous simulation. It is the mental background noise that becomes deafening only when there is no meaningful foreground to distract it. It is the administrative assistant of your soul, suddenly working overtime, unbidden, and without any sense of appropriate timing. Imagine your mind not as a pristine, singular command center, but as a vast, ancient walled city. During the day, the mayor, your rational conscious will, maintains a precarious order through focused effort. But as the clock ticks toward the deep night and the mayor officially retires, the streets are suddenly overrun by factions who have been waiting patiently in the shadows. The critics start shouting demands from the rooftops. The regrets convene an emergency parliamentary session focused solely on the year 2017. And the what-ifs, those insidious little planners, begin drawing blueprints for impossible escapes and worst-case scenarios. You are the sole, exhausted citizen trapped within, observing the riot, entirely powerless to call in the guard, because in this territory, you are the guard, and the guard has just gone rogue. This is the fundamental paradox of cognitive self-governance. You possess the mechanism, yet you cannot reliably command its output. Every impulse to stop thinking, every sincere instruction to the brain to just be quiet, is itself a thought. A new data point further fueling the engine of insomnia. You are trapped in a vicious feedback loop of intention versus execution. The mind is generating internal data faster than your conscious self can process or dismiss it. You become the passive recipient of your own internal broadcast, desperately trying to change the channel while holding a remote control that only cycles through increasingly distressing reruns. The tension escalates because you believe intellectual control is always possible, while the biological reality suggests that thinking is, in many states, a reflex, a non-negotiable metabolic cost, especially when the body slows down and the threat sensors ramp up. In the hyper-optimized modern world, we train ourselves to believe that every waking moment must be productive, every problem solvable, every thought controllable. This insistence on constant management inevitably bleeds into the night. We treat the inner monologue not as a natural, albeit overwhelming biological function, but as an error that needs debugging. We try to solve our thoughts, viewing sleeplessness as a profound performance failure. Emotionally, this territory becomes the midnight dumping ground for the deep anxieties we successfully compartmentalize during the structured hours of the day. The professional mask dissolves, and the raw, unfiltered stream of worry takes the microphone. The territory of the mind is only insurgent because you refuse to grant it amnesty. The true psychological impact of this nightly confrontation is the erosion of the ego's myth of sovereignty. It forces you to confront the unsettling realization that you, the centered, deliberate self you present to the world, are merely a fraction of what is happening inside your skull. The vast majority of your mental activity operates outside your conscious purview, a subterranean current moving massive amounts of information. This realization is not a surrender to weakness, but an acknowledgement of overwhelming complexity. It shifts the burden of control away from the impossible task of silencing the mind, toward the more sustainable task of witnessing it. You are not the conductor of the cognitive orchestra. You are merely the audience member who happens to be stuck in the front row, holding a lifetime ticket. Tonight, listen not for the absence of thought, but for the inherent, restless energy of consciousness itself. The inner monologue is insurgent only if you declare war against it. If you yield to the chaos, the sound stops being warfare and settles into the steady, chaotic rhythm of existing. You are waiting for sleep, but the universe is simply waiting for your next thought. The failure of reason in the final hour. This is the Cartesian dusk, the moment the proud pillar of cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, finally begins to crumble under the relentless gravitational pull of biological exhaustion. You spend the daylight hours constructing a meticulous fortress of logic, systems, and calculated expectation. But what happens when the very guards you hired to protect the gate turn against it just as the light fades? Why is your mind loudest precisely when it is supposed to be silent? This final hour, the gap between the last task and the first moment of true unconsciousness, is the scene of our most profound philosophical confrontation. It is the necessary exhaustion of the system manager. Reason, our most celebrated tool, is inherently a daylight mechanism. It relies on structure, linearity, evidence, and clear objectives. But the final hour is nonlinear. It is characterized by the sudden, tyrannical reign of the immediate. The rational, awake self, the CEO of your day, is forced to relinquish control to the impulsive, nocturnal self, yet it fights the transfer of power with desperate, frantic energy. Imagine your consciousness as a vast, highly organized library. Throughout the day, you diligently categorize, shelve, and reference information, maintaining perfect order. But the moment you lie down, the chief librarian, reason, collapses from fatigue. Now, all the books that were barely stable, the fears you suppressed, the embarrassing memories, the unwritten emails, the existential doubts, slide off the shelves and begin whispering simultaneously. They demand to be read, cataloged, or burned right now. The failure you experience isn't a lapse in intelligence, it's a failure of governance rooted in necessary exhaustion. The core paradox is excruciatingly simple. The more intensely you try to enforce silence or solve a problem, the more energy you dedicate to the waking mind, signaling danger and keeping the entire system alert. Sleep requires surrender, a passive agreement to dissolve boundaries, but reason is built on active assertion, definition, and control. When you command yourself to stop thinking, you are not resting. You are still actively thinking about stopping thinking. This feedback loop is the final, desperate victory of the ego. It would rather worry itself sick than admit it cannot govern the coming darkness. It wields logic as a weapon against rest. Obsessively analyzing past mistakes or calculating future worst-case scenarios, all while knowing, rationally, that zero progress will be made at 3 in the morning. Yet the mechanism persists, fueled by the mistaken belief that if you stop thinking about the problem will somehow sneak up on you. This modern struggle is profoundly rooted in our culture of productivity. We have been conditioned to equate being busy with being important, demanding that the mind never truly rest, that every spare moment be optimized for output or self-improvement. We carry this tyrannical expectation directly into the bedroom. We treat sleep not as a fundamental biological necessity, but as an earned reward, or worse, an inefficient hurdle. If we haven't solved all our emotional, professional, and existential problems by midnight, we feel we have failed our day, and that failure becomes internalized, becoming the very fuel for the sleeplessness. The true lesson of the failure of reason in the final hour is humility. It is the ultimate moment the self realizes it is not a pure, disembodied intelligence operating a vessel, but an intelligence emerging from a body with fundamental, non-negotiable needs. The failure of logic is the success of instinct. You learn that control is fundamentally an illusion, a temporary truce negotiated with the chaos that underpins existence. The mind's obsessive loops. Did I lock the door? Was that email too harsh? Will I ever be happy? Are not logical inquiries. They are the sputtering, desperate attempts of the ego to find one last thing to manage before it shuts down. Reason can meticulously build the wall, but only surrender can lower the drawbridge. You must allow the fortress of the self to be occupied by the gentle, formless force of the night. The deepest truth is revealed only when the logical mind finally gives up the fight. The only thing you can truly control in the final hour is the willingness to let go of control itself. Perpetual present tense of waiting. You've spent the entire day managing your outputs, controlling your schedule, and refining your reactions. You believe that effort applied yields proportionate reward. Why is this final, most essential surrender, the simple, necessary act of falling asleep, the one thing that violently resists control? Why, when you try the hardest, does sleep recede the fastest? We usually define waiting as an empty space between now and an anticipated future. But when you are waiting for sleep, the future state is only seconds away, yet somehow unreachable. This specific waiting is an act of acute self-monitoring. It is the precise moment when the rational mind, usually your most trusted ally, turns into a relentless accountant, auditing every second you fail to cross the threshold of consciousness. The waiting itself becomes pressurized, hostile time. Imagine floating in the deepest part of the ocean. The goal is simple: remain buoyant. But if you analyze the mechanics of buoyancy too closely, if you try to force the water to hold you, you introduce tension. The effort pulls you under. Sleep operates on the same principle of natural buoyancy. It is a state achieved only when the body stops analyzing the logistics of floating. You are actively trying to do nothing, yet that very intention is inherently an act of doing. You've replaced the calm, passive acceptance required for rest with the sharp, focused energy of an urgent task. This is the genesis of the central paradox, the perpetual present tense of waiting. You check the clock. Maybe 3 hours until the alarm, possibly 5. I must sleep now, you tell yourself. That command generates immediate cognitive friction and a surge of adrenaline, not the soothing flow of melatonin. The adrenaline creates tension. The tension ensures wakefulness. The resulting wakefulness heightens your anxiety about the cost of not sleeping. And then you are back at the start, only now the pressure is amplified by the knowledge of time lost. You are stuck in a narrative loop. The mechanism is simple, yet brutal. The required condition for sleep is relaxation, and the mechanism by which you pursue sleep, the conscious intention, is itself a form of stress. It is the only goal in life where the sheer act of observing the goal's progress instantly destroys the possibility of achieving it. The clock isn't counting down toward rest. It's looping back to renewed effort. You are perpetually present in the struggle, incapable of stepping forward into the future state of rest, because the present is defined by the failure to move. This struggle is so profoundly frustrating because it violates the fundamental promise of modern, goal-oriented life, that effort equals reward. We train ourselves relentlessly to believe that if we apply enough focus, enough energy, we can conquer any problem, physical or mental. We manage our data, we optimize our productivity, we track every bodily function. Yet here, in the dark silence, the final metric, the efficiency of our rest, is held hostage by our attempt to measure it. The inability to intentionally control the moment of surrender exposes the deep, humbling fragility of the autonomous self. It reveals the hard limit of executive function. The only way out of the perpetual present tense is philosophical surrender. This is not about magically letting go of the anxiety, which is just another task added to the list. It is about accepting the anxiety as part of the neutral landscape of the moment. When you stop fighting the waiting stops being an opponent and simply becomes the environment. The brain realizes the stakes are only temporary, only manufactured by the illusion of control you insisted upon. The moment you decide it doesn't matter how long you wait, that the clock is irrelevant, you reclaim your power from the intention. You relax the demand for performance from your existence. True rest is achieved not by chasing sleep, but by finally allowing yourself the radical acceptance of wakefulness. The waiting ends the moment you stop waiting for the waiting to end. Roar of the mind. When the world is quiet. The moment the world agrees to stop demanding your attention, when the screen is black, the door is locked, and the silence has settled like dust, that is precisely when the mind begins its deafening internal broadcast. This is the paradox we call the tyranny of the immediate future. Have you ever noticed that the moment you close your eyes, intending to simply be, is the exact moment you are tasked with becoming the meticulous project manager of your own past mistakes and future anxieties? We crave silence to recharge, believing that the absence of external noise guarantees internal peace. But what happens when the constant stimuli, the necessary distractions that usually tether us to the observable world, are finally removed? The mind, a highly efficient processing unit designed primarily for problem solving and threat assessment, finds itself without an external enemy. It immediately pivots, turning its powerful focus inward, perceiving every unprocessed thought, unsent email, or half-forgotten obligation as an immediate existential threat that must be neutralized before dawn. This shift from managing tangible external chaos to attempting to control intangible internal silence is the front line where the illusion of command breaks down. We believe we can, or worse must, will sleep into existence, as if slumber were a measurable deliverable. Imagine the solitary lighthouse keeper on a perfectly calm, moonless night. His function is crisis management. His purpose is to guide ships away from the reef during storms. But tonight the sea is smooth, the horizon is empty, and the only light is the harsh revolving beam reflecting off the walls of his own small tower. The vastness of the empty sea becomes terrifying not because of the danger it holds, but because of the sheer lack of immediate danger to fight. He has nothing to oppose, nothing to fix, nothing to manage but the terrifying echo of his own solitude. The emptiness demands vigilance, and the keeper finds himself terrified by the potential, the absence, the uncontrollable void just beyond the glass. This is the mechanism of the nighttime roar. The brain, hardwired for survival, interprets uncertainty itself as a high-priority threat. Sleep requires surrender, a temporary evolutionary lapse in vigilance. To compensate for this necessary loss of control, the mind enters a state of hypervigilance, attempting to preemptively solve every potential problem of the next 3 days, mistaking detailed planning for actual safety. This transforms planning into a form of exhausting mental surveillance. The harder you try to command the noise to stop, the infamous "don't think about the white bear" mechanism, the louder the thoughts become. The very attempt to impose control generates the frantic energy you are trying to extinguish. The solution becomes the poison. This cyclical, nocturnal planning session is the emotional echo of our modern productivity culture. We don't just seek rest, we attempt to optimize our rest. We feel guilt over unstructured time, and we try to schedule our unconsciousness, filling the internal void with to-do lists and hypothetical arguments. This is the ultimate performance anxiety, the anxiety of the unmanaged self. If you are not in control of your thoughts, then who is? And if you cannot even control the process of falling asleep, what control do you truly possess over anything else? The fear of the unmanaged mind is the real subject of the late-night panic. Understanding this allows us to distinguish between genuinely useful introspection and toxic, cyclical rumination. The noise isn't an external enemy that must be crushed. It is merely the sound of the internal engine, revving hard and neutral, refusing to shut down because it perceives its shutdown as dangerous. The moment of true letting go is not about doing something to the thoughts or conquering them, but about allowing them to pass through the mental space without demanding they be solved right now. The control we truly crave is the permission to stop controlling. The roar you hear in the quiet is not the world demanding your attention, nor is it evidence of your failure. It is merely the sound of your own defenses collapsing, whispering the profound, counterintuitive truth that the greatest power you possess is the temporary relinquishment of all power. Puppet who believes it holds the strings. You are lying here, trying to steer your mind away from tomorrow's anxieties, convinced that you are the navigator. But what if the very act of trying is just the string pulling the puppet's hand? Can you control the desire to control? This is the central friction of the human experience, the paradox of volition. We define control as the intentional manipulation of outcomes. It is the core mechanism of the ego. I decide, therefore I am. This belief structure is vital for daily functioning. You choose your clothes, your route, your words. However, as the darkness settles and the mechanisms of the day shut down, the weight of everything you didn't choose becomes overwhelming. Your metabolism, your DNA, the gravitational pull, the global market, the weather, these are the unchosen foundations upon which your choices stand. The paradox of volition suggests that the self you identify with is less a conscious author and more a highly complex compilation of influences, reacting seamlessly and predictably to its environment. Imagine a magnificent ship sailing through a violent storm. You are the captain, diligently shouting orders and gripping the helm. You genuinely believe you are setting the course. But the ship itself, built decades ago by unseen engineers, is following currents established eons ago, powered by winds you did not summon. Your control is not the creation of the wind, but merely the management of the rudder, a tiny strenuous correction against overwhelming deterministic force. And even the decision to turn the rudder? That impulse arose from training, instinct, and a threat assessment system operating milliseconds beneath conscious thought. The illusion resides in the feeling of authorship, not the objective existence of unrestrained agency. The mechanism governing this feeling is self-deception by necessity. To maintain sanity, motivation, and purpose, the brain edits reality, prioritizing internal narratives over complex external causation. We must believe in personal responsibility to function. This belief structure creates selective claiming. When you succeed, you claim the action. I earned this. I made that happen. When you fail, you instinctively assign external blame. The circumstances were unfair. The system was rigged. This selective claiming of ownership is the puppet tightening its own invisible strings, reinforcing the narrative of mastery. The internal tension emerges acutely when you try to force a purely biological response, like commanding sleep or commanding total relaxation. You observe the sleeplessness and immediately assign the task of fixing it to the conscious mind. The harder you pull the string of control, the more demanding you are of your body, the more resistance the universe, and specifically your own autonomous nervous system, provides. Insight arrives when you realize that waiting, allowing, and observing the system are often far more effective controls than demanding action. Your conscious will, in this context, is often just the eloquent spokesperson for deeper, deterministic processes already underway, attempting to take credit for their execution. Look at the specific anxiety that keeps you awake now. It is the ultimate expression of failed control, a future scenario that might happen, which you currently lack the power to prevent, manipulate, or finalize. You replay conversations. You plan contingencies. You attempt to pre-solve tomorrow before the sun rises. This mental activity is frantic, desperate control maintenance. It is the internal, unconscious realization that if you stop actively holding the strings, the puppet might collapse, forgetting its lines, forgetting its purpose. We trade genuine, effortless presence for the manufactured, tiring security of planning, tragically mistaking the map for the actual territory. The moment you truly accept that your capacity for fundamental control is deeply limited, that you are perhaps the most sophisticated and beautiful domino in a chain stretching back billions of years, is not a moment of defeat. It is a profound, immediate psychological relief. The crippling, exhausting burden of total responsibility for every outcome dissolves. You shift from being the frantic owner of every result to being the willing, engaged participant in an unfolding drama. Freedom, paradoxically, is not found in seizing the strings, but in observing them, recognizing them for what they are. The elegant, universal mechanism of reality, acting through you. Release the grip on the strings you never truly held. Let the puppet rest. The greatest act of control is the willingness to surrender to the current, uncontrolled moment. You are not the driver of the dream. You are the one being dreamed. The weight of needing to not need anything. You lie there, suspended in that uncomfortable space between wakefulness and surrender, and the mind starts checking its inventory. It's not checking for external threats, but for internal dependencies. And that's where the true existential weight settles, the profound, exhausting effort required to maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency. You understand the ideal, a state of true freedom, defined not by what you possess, but by what you don't require. It's the ambition to achieve perfect emotional non-porosity, where no external stimulus, no relationship, no unmet expectation can pierce the calm surface of your psyche. We call this resilience, but when pursued relentlessly, it mutates into something pathological. The paralyzing fear of vulnerability manifest as the chronic need to not need anything. The paradox sets in immediately. The very act of enforcing this detached sovereignty creates a new, rigid necessity, the constant high-stakes need for control over your internal landscape. You are not free. You are a prison guard of your own desires. You have simply exchanged the soft chains of dependency for the cold, unyielding armor of absolute autonomy. Consider the metaphor of the architect who builds a flawless cantilever bridge, perfectly balanced, beautiful in its defiance of gravity. But the architect lives under the bridge, spending every hour terrified that the smallest shift in wind or temperature will expose the hidden stress fracture. Your mind becomes this architect. You cannot relax, because relaxation means letting down the internal bracing mechanisms that keep your structure of non-need from collapsing. The mechanism of this self-betrayal is subtle. You are convinced that admitting a need for comfort, for validation, for partnership, for rest, is equivalent to signing a contract for future pain. So, you aggressively neutralize desire. You treat the impulse to reach out or rely on another person as a strategic weakness to be eliminated from your personal inventory. This denial is not strength. It is a profound form of internal management, where your energy is spent running away from acceptance, not running toward freedom. Think about how this plays out in your most intimate moments. You practice emotional scarcity. You withhold small, gentle truths, not out of malice, but because acknowledging that another person brings light or stability into your life feels like handing them the lever to your entire world. You treat every act of asking for help, every display of genuine, messy human wanting as a catastrophic exposure. The refusal to lean becomes the ultimate performance. If I can prove that I do not need the promotion, I cannot be hurt when I don't get it. If I can prove I do not need this person, I cannot be wounded when they leave. But this strategy has a devastating psychological cost. When you need to not need anything, you are essentially demanding that the universe conform to your enforced self-sufficiency. You require the world to be a place of neutral, silent background noise, because any disruption, any offer of help, any possibility of shared burden threatens your precarious structure. You become hypervigilant, scanning the horizon for anything that might tempt you back into the dangerous territory of human connection. The result is total responsibility for the quiet, isolating silence you have built around yourself. The strength you are desperately chasing is not found in the refusal to lean. True strength is the radical acceptance of fundamental human interdependency. It is the understanding that you are not diminished by wanting, but expanded by allowing the world to occasionally hold you. Stop guarding the gate. Stop checking the inventory. The weight of needing to not need anything is infinitely heavier than the weight of simply asking for what you genuinely require. Let the vigilance soften. Let the rigid expectation of perfect autonomy dissolve. The safety you seek is not in the armor, but in the slow, terrifying courage of surrender. We're halfway through this journey. Maybe you've closed your eyes, but your mind is still learning. Subscribe now and stay with us for what's coming next. The sleepless curator of unsolicited thoughts. The moment the light switch clicks off, the environment goes dark and silence is invited in. That is precisely the moment your mind decides it's opening night. How can true rest be achieved when the internal gallery of worries decides to hold its mandatory annual viewing, demanding your full attention right before you attempt to slip into unconsciousness? The sleepless curator isn't anxiety, not precisely. It's the meticulous, almost bureaucratic function of your brain that collects all the irrelevant, incomplete, or embarrassing mental notes you successfully suppressed during the efficiency of the day and presents them for immediate, mandatory review. It's the psychological equivalent of a server running a massive, taxing backup operation right when you try to stream a movie. Why does this sudden, stressful inventory begin precisely when stillness is your goal? Because you have temporarily surrendered executive control, and the subconscious sees this window of vulnerability as the perfect opportunity to finally tidy up the messy corners of the emotional vault. Imagine your mind as a sprawling underground museum. During the day, you are the efficient security guard, deciding which wings are open to the public, setting the boundaries, and keeping the storage units locked tight. But when you lie down, the guard clocks out and the curator steps in. He doesn't usher you toward the masterpieces of clarity or the beautiful moments of the past week. Instead, he unveils the forgotten relics, the failed sketches of future plans, the awkward email you sent in 2013, the half-formed arguments you never won, and the minor, yet lingering insecurities that need dusting off. He doesn't curate beauty, he curates emotional friction. Every thought displayed comes with a small, glowing placard reading, "Urgent, must be resolved immediately." This is the core paradox of the struggling mind. The very act of trying to silence the curator is the act of giving him a rapt, captive audience. You recognize the thought, a worry about a minor task next Tuesday, a lingering ambiguity about a relationship, and instantly you engage. You try to wrestle the projection off the screen, but mental effort is the curator's fuel. The more desperately you seek the off switch, the brighter the spotlights become, making the exhibition hall feel smaller, hotter, and unbearably urgent. Your logical self knows these items are non-critical, yet your emotional self is trapped, forced to critique the entire catalog of perceived failures and potential disasters until dawn. The control you crave is precisely the control that is denied to you in that crucial transitional state. In our hyper-connected world, the curator is severely overworked. We ingest thousands of data points daily, the crushing volume of news cycles, the toxic stream of social media comparisons, the never-ending performance metrics, and we rarely give ourselves the passive time necessary to process the load. The moment we force stillness, the system compensates. The curator is simply running the backlog of noise we accumulated, demanding that we finally acknowledge the sheer volume of mental clutter we have chosen to carry. It is not malicious. It is merely algorithmic maintenance. It recognizes that the only time you are truly still is the only time it can truly run its required diagnostic sweep. The profound shift comes when you realize the curator needs no response from you. You are not required to buy the art. You are merely asked to observe the exhibition hall doors swing shut for the evening. If you can accept that the brain, like any complex machine, has mandatory maintenance cycles that run outside your immediate command, you can change your role from engaged participant to passive observer. The thoughts are merely noise, not commands. They are inventory reports, not final judgments. Allowing the brain to process without intervention is the highest form of self-control in this moment, the control of non-reaction, the surrender to necessary chaos. Stop fighting the current of the unsleeping mind. Let the curator continue his work in the periphery. Know that the illusion of control is strongest when you are fully awake, but true peace arrives only when you acknowledge that some processes are sacredly beyond your immediate jurisdiction. The thoughts are not happening to you, they are happening through you, and soon the museum will close. The committee of yesterday governing tomorrow. You are lying here, suspended between the noise of the day and the silence of the eventual deep sleep, feeling an undeniable drag. It is the subtle, magnetic weight of inevitability. Why does tomorrow already feel decided? Why do you sense that the crucial choices awaiting you have already been stamped and filed by a version of you that no longer exists? This is the work of the committee of yesterday governing tomorrow. The committee is not a metaphor for fate. It is the active bureaucracy of your own mind. It is composed of every promise you ever made, every fear you never resolved, every default emotional setting established when you were less equipped to handle complexity, when you are still waiting for the cognitive engine to power down. The committee convenes in the archives of your consciousness. They are the cumulative weight of your historical self, holding the majority vote on all future actions. Their power is subtle. They don't demand a specific outcome. They simply predetermine the acceptable boundaries of your behavior, the range of anxieties you must revisit, and the established narratives you must uphold. Imagine your consciousness as an old, dimly lit government building. Every time you try to launch a new initiative, a major life change, a genuine shift in attitude, or a profound moment of forgiveness, the proposal must first pass through several dusty offices. These are the offices of past regrets, unfinished business, and conditional beliefs. The committee doesn't debate the future. They simply look up the minutes from the meeting of 10 years ago and confirm, yes, this person has committed to finding validation through achievement, despite the cost. Yes, this person is contractually obligated to worry about financial stability, regardless of current funds. They operate on inertia. They dictate the default settings, ensuring that tomorrow's actions feel like mere repetitions of yesterday's decisions. The paradox here is profound. You celebrate the idea of free will, yet you execute the agenda dictated by a younger, less informed, and often traumatized version of yourself. You believe you are a fresh decision maker in the present moment, but in reality, you are often just the administrative assistant, dutifully carrying out the rubber-stamped motions of a board of directors you appointed years ago. They hold the power because you delegated it during moments of emotional intensity or cognitive exhaustion, allowing those fleeting, intense commitments to become permanent statutes. Every time you find yourself defaulting to an anxious pattern, responding defensively to a loved one, or sabotaging a healthy habit, you are witnessing the direct influence of the committee. They are simply ensuring consistency, a consistency that feels safe, even if it is agonizing. The committee specializes in making change feel impossibly heavy. When you decide to shift your internal landscape to finally let go of an old grudge or adopt a radical optimism, the committee raises a point of order. Wait, according to the archives, this behavior is inconsistent with our established identity. We must maintain the narrative. This internal friction is why self-improvement often stalls. It isn't a lack of discipline. It is a conflict of authority, a battle to repeal old laws you unconsciously wrote for yourself. The dread that sometimes catches you before sleep is the sound of the committee finalizing the next day's schedule of obligations and anxieties. To gain sovereignty over tomorrow, you must dissolve the legislative power of yesterday. This requires the dangerous and essential work of auditing the archives, questioning the necessity of old debts, and challenging the legitimacy of the historical self. You must recall the committee into session, but this time under the illumination of the present moment when your conscious awareness is sharpest. Ask yourself in this quiet, solitary space, what past commitments are still draining my future potential? Which anxieties am I mandated to revisit by a version of me that was only guessing? The true freedom available to you now is not the freedom to make choices, but the freedom to revoke mandates. It is the realization that the past is only binding if you continue to allow it a vote. You are not defined by the sum of your historical defaults. You are defined by your capacity to declare a state of emergency and suspend the rules of the committee. Stop waiting for the committee to retire. Dissolve their power by refusing to execute their minutes. Wake up to the power of this single precious night to rewrite tomorrow. The committee of yesterday only governs tomorrow if you fail to hold the meeting of today. The act of witnessing one's own collapse, the phenomenon of the detached observer of ruin. This is the act of witnessing your own emotional collapse without the urgent need to intervene or save the parts that are already broken. Have you ever felt your emotional foundations give way, your carefully constructed narrative of stability shattering, and yet deep within the silence, a separate part of you simply watched? No judgment, no panic, just observation. It's a strange comfort found not in resilience, but in the acknowledgement of terminal fatigue. This isn't morbid, it's cognitive architecture. The mind in extremis attempts a radical form of triage. When the executive functions dedicated to holding things together finally fail, when the facade of control is burned away by exhaustion or existential stress, the observing consciousness, the fundamental you, doesn't extinguish. Instead, it reclines, switching from active management to passive recording. This is the moment the illusion of control finally yields, not with a bang of tragedy, but with a quiet, analytical click. You are watching the end of a chapter, perhaps the end of the identity you thought you needed to maintain, and the watcher is utterly safe from the collapse it chronicles. Imagine yourself standing on a remote hill, watching a structure you built, perhaps a fragile tower of expectations, professional demands, and old habits, being battered by an inevitable storm. You spent decades cementing every brick, believing that if you just controlled the weather, the structure would stand forever. But tonight, the wind is too strong. You see the stress cracks spiderwebbing across the facade. The roof tears off, the walls buckle. You should be frantic, running to reinforce it, yet you are motionless. The structure belongs to the past self, the self that needed control. The self-observing is the future self, already accepting the rubble. You are simultaneously the architect, the victim, and the documentary filmmaker of your own undoing. The tension here is exquisite. The body feels the trauma, the cortisol spikes, the chest tightens with the recognition of defeat. But the witness feels a strange, cold relief. The paradox is that genuine freedom often arrives when you stop trying to prevent the thing you dread. You realize that your deepest fear was not the collapse itself, but the effort required to perpetually prevent it. When the effort stops, the mind clarifies. The energy that was tied up in performance and prevention is suddenly liberated. It's uncomfortable, yes, it feels like an exposure, but exposure strips away everything that wasn't essential. This witnessing is the mind admitting, I am no longer in charge of this particular moment of entropy, and perhaps I never truly was. This mechanism operates in smaller scales every day, especially here in the dark. When you replay a mistake from the afternoon, a moment of poor judgment or emotional overreach, and you feel the shame rise, watch closer. There is a secondary processing unit that doesn't feel the shame. It simply catalogs the data. It calculates the necessary adjustments for tomorrow. In the modern world where we are trained to project unwavering competence, witnessing our own faults without immediate defensive maneuvering is a radical act of self-honesty. We fear the collapse because we believe stability means perfection. But true stability is built on the ruins we acknowledge, not the ones we ignore. The profound impact of this act is the necessary separation of the self from the ego's structures. The ego demands victory and survival at all costs, defining you by your achievements and your ability to maintain order. The witness knows that these external structures are ephemeral. When you allow yourself to witness your personal wreckage, financial, relational, emotional, you discover that your fundamental identity is not defined by the state of your circumstances, but by the fact that you possess the consciousness capable of observing those circumstances. The knowledge that you endure, even when your world doesn't, is the bedrock of non-reactive resilience. It is the ultimate insurance policy against the illusion of control. Tonight, if you feel the soft edges of your control fraying, do not fight it, just watch. Because the only part of you that matters is the witness, and the witness can never be destroyed. It merely closes its eyes when the dust settles, ready for the next dawn. The comfort of knowing nothing is truly fixed. The deepest tension as you lie here, suspended between the demanding light of yesterday and the unknown dawn of tomorrow, is the inherent clash between your desperate need for certainty and the universe's unwavering commitment to flux. We call this radical contradiction. The comfort of knowing nothing is truly fixed. The mind, tireless surveyor of boundaries, spends its waking hours trying to build mental walls strong enough to hold back the tide of change. You obsessively categorize your assets, review your schedule, and try to pre-grieve potential losses, all in the illusory service of preparation. But consider this. If everything you believe to be solid, your current status, your defining relationships, even your physical health and self-perception, is actually fluid, moving, and dissolving in real time, how much energy are you wasting trying to grip water? The effort to maintain the illusion of stability is the true source of your fatigue. Is it possible that the greatest peace you could attain right now is not through finding a fixed point to anchor to, but through the profound, absolute acceptance of the drift? This concept is not rooted in nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, but in dynamic realism, the acknowledgement that everything matters right now, but only temporarily. It is the recognition that the fundamental nature of existence is change, not merely sequential change, but simultaneous transformation. Everything is perpetually becoming something else. In ancient philosophy, this was understood as the constant flowing river. You never step into the same stream twice, and crucially, you are never the same self who steps. The relevance is profoundly immediate. Your anxiety about future failure, or your lingering regret about past mistakes, relies entirely on the premise that the conditions, emotional states, and circumstances that created those feelings are permanently etched onto your timeline. They are not. They are already dissolving into history. Imagine you are holding a complex, perfectly constructed sand mandala. You spent weeks, months perhaps, meticulously placing every grain of colored sand to create a flawless geometry of your perfect life, your defined success, your invulnerable security. The effort of maintenance is exhausting. You breathe shallowly, fearful that the slightest tremor, the smallest breath will shatter the design. You cannot truly live while guarding it. Now imagine a gentle, inevitable wind arrives, signifying the universal law of entropy. The moment you decide to proactively sweep that perfect sand into a single, unified pile and release it back to the earth, the moment you acknowledge that its value was in the making and the experience, not the holding, is the moment the tension drains from your shoulders. The destruction of the form is the freedom of the material. That sand can be anything again. And because you are composed of that same fluid material, so can you. The mechanism of control is built on a cognitive paradox. We believe stability leads to safety, yet the pursuit of stability necessitates constant, exhausting effort against an unstoppable universal force. We try to pin down happiness, define success, and catalog relationships, treating life like a museum exhibit rather than a living, chaotic ecosystem. The internal conflict arises when the evidence of reality, the job that changed, the friend who moved on, the health scare that emerged, slams into the psychological dogma that everything should stay predictable and manageable. The tension is the friction between expectation and experience. The profound insight is realizing that when you stop trying to anchor yourself to yesterday's landscape, the inevitable transformation of tomorrow ceases to be a threat and becomes pure, unscripted potential. In the frantic pace of modern life, we internalize the idea of fixing things. Fix the problem, fix the flaw, fix the schedule. But consider your emotional states right now, lying here in the dark. If you are anxious, you are anticipating a fixed negative outcome. If you are sad, you are clinging to a fixed lost pleasure. Applying the comfort of non-fixity means recognizing that the emotional cloud you are under is subject to the same laws of weather as a storm front. It is moving, it is dispersing. Your current feeling is only a temporary configuration of energy and thought. It has no structural permanence unless you desperately try to keep it anchored in place through rumination. Psychologically, accepting impermanence radically shifts the locus of control. You move from the exhausting role of the static guardian, the person desperately trying to hold the mental walls up, to the resilient observer. The philosophical change is profound. The self is no longer defined by fixed achievements or failures, but by the continuous capacity to adapt and reconstitute. When nothing is fixed, failure loses its finality, and success loses its crushing pressure to be maintained forever. You become lighter, more buoyant, capable of navigating the currents because you are no longer fighting them. The greatest comfort of knowing nothing is fixed is the realization that your mistakes are also not fixed. They are already being carried away by the river of time. Allow the current moment, with all its unsolved equations and temporary discomforts, to simply be, knowing that this configuration of events will never exist again. Stop seeking bedrock in the shifting sands. The deepest sleep comes when you finally release the oars and surrender to the fact that the entire restless river is the destination. The unlit room where all truths are visible. We are now entering the paradox of passive clarity, the precise moment when the intentional, aggressive pursuit of mental peace finally fails, and truth, uninvited and unforgiving, walks in. Have you ever noticed how the most crucial answers you spend the daylight hours frantically searching for only surface when you are absolutely forced to stop searching? When the lights are out, when your body is pinned by the weight of fatigue and the mind is strictly forbidden from doing, it begins to simply see. This unlit room is not a physical place. It is the boundary condition of consciousness, that narrow, liminal space often referred to as the hypnagogic state. It is the moment where your internal editor, that rigid CEO of the waking self, the one tasked with maintaining the illusion of control, begins to clock out. All day, you filter, you prioritize, you suppress, ensuring the narrative that you are managing everything remains impeccably intact. But in this imposed quiet dark, those cognitive filters weaken. The context is simple and unavoidable. Control is a daylight activity. When the sun sets internally, the subconscious backlog surfaces, unfiltered and demanding immediate acknowledgement. Imagine your mind as a vast, meticulously organized and intensely political library. During the day, the librarian, who is your highly motivated ego, meticulously curates which books are visible, which shelves are dusted, and most importantly, which critical, dangerous sections are locked securely behind a velvet rope labeled "Do Not Enter Until Fully Processed." The unlit room is the night when the librarian, finally defeated by exhaustion, collapses silently on the floor, and the restricted sections automatically swing open. You are no longer actively looking for the truth. You are merely present in the space when the truth spills out onto the polished marble, scattering the index cards of your carefully constructed, fragile reality. The mechanism of this sudden clarity is precisely why it feels so profoundly uncomfortable and unsettling. You are forced into the immediate recognition that your exhausting, round-the-clock efforts to suppress an anxiety or to force the resolution of a difficult, entrenched decision are the very actions sustaining them. The tension you feel is not the inherent difficulty of the problem itself. The tension is the energy you relentlessly spend fighting the emergence of the problem. The subconscious does not communicate in linear logic or measured steps. It communicates in vivid, immediate emotional resonance. You don't receive a strategic bullet-pointed memo. You receive the sudden flash of a long-buried regret, the immediate and raw recognition of a promise you allowed to break, or the terrifyingly simple insight that a great, crippling fear is actually just a complicated misunderstanding of your own capability. This is the ultimate paradox of the quiet dark. The moment you absolutely surrender the desire to understand or to fix what is broken is the exact moment understanding floods the empty space. In our modern life, where distraction is a highly engineered and monetized commodity, we fear this unlit room more viscerally than we fear public failure. We scroll until the very last possible second, filling the inescapable silence with unnecessary noise, trying desperately to keep that exhausting librarian awake and on guard. Why this desperate avoidance? Because the truth made visible in the dark often ruthlessly reveals that the things we thought we had secured our career path, the longevity of our relationships, the foundational solidity of our inner peace, are far more porous and vulnerable than we ever dared to admit during the loud clarity of the day. This passive clarity demands an authentic response, an authentic engagement, particularly with the self, is perhaps the most tiring activity there is. The lasting psychological and philosophical impact of inhabiting this space is a crucial, undeniable shift from doing to fundamentally being. It is the realization that genuine wisdom is not acquired through strategic force or aggressive searching, but through the deep, necessary humility of stillness. You leave that unlit room not necessarily resolved, but profoundly and permanently informed. The clarity gained isn't a complex new strategy. It's an undeniable internal map. You realize that the hidden truths about yourself, the vulnerabilities you deny, the weaknesses you strategically cover, are not enemies or liabilities. They are simply factual, structural components of the complex architecture you inhabit. There is a deep, quiet, awe-inspiring humility in acknowledging that the most important revelations concerning your life arrive when you are least prepared for them, and often when you are trying desperately to ignore them completely. So tonight, let the conscious lights dim, let the room go deeply dark. Trust the fact that the things you truly need to see will always be perfectly illuminated, even in the deepest silence, by the faint, inescapable glow of your own reality. The small daily death we fight against. When the lights are finally out and the immediate future is nothing but a black canvas of waiting, why do you feel this strange, deep sense of personal deficit? It's not merely fatigue. It is a quiet, internal judgment levied against the efficiency of the day, now vanished. This phenomenon has a name: the inevitable attrition of identity, or what existential philosophers refer to as the small daily death. It is the fight we wage against the irreversible passage of time, a mortality experienced not in the body, but in the slow, subtle erosion of the self you intended to be. This is the realization that every choice made was also a million choices unmade. Every minute spent was a minute irrevocably lost to everything else. You are defining your life minute by minute through constant subtraction. This isn't a grand, catastrophic death. It is the quiet, psychological erosion of potential energy. It measures the growing distance between the ambitious, pristine person you intended to be when the alarm first rang, and the compromised, weary version of yourself now lying in the dark. Imagine your ideal self as a perfect, tightly sealed vessel, capable of traversing any profound ocean. Now think of the daily routines, the bureaucratic hurdles, the mandatory meetings, the traffic, the trivial disagreements, the endless, necessary maintenance of existence, as microscopic barnacles adhering to the hull. Individually, they are meaningless, but collectively, they weigh the vessel down. They compromise the efficiency of the structure. By the time you reach the harbor of bedtime, you realize the ship is heavier, slower, and some part of its pristine, theoretical surface has been permanently sacrificed to the simple necessity of movement. This is not malicious damage, it is the inevitable toll extracted by existing within time. The deepest irony is that we actively manufacture this attrition in the name of self-preservation and control. We construct elaborate systems of schedules, routines, and boundaries to ensure efficiency, prioritizing what is necessary over what is vital. We trade spontaneous, fluid existence for managed, predictable existence. This meticulous framework gives us the illusion of mastery over time, ensuring the train stays strictly on the tracks. But trains only move where the tracks are already laid. The small daily death is the psychological cost of that track laying. The wild, exciting, divergent paths are paved over with necessity and immediate obligation. The internal tension of this compromise surfaces precisely when the controlled mind is finally forced into inactivity. The self cries out for the authenticity and the creative chaos you spent 12 hours systematically suppressing. You lie there and recognize the truth. The The life you designed to manage the chaos is slowly suffocating the very spirit that seeks fulfillment. You mastered the day, but you killed some essential part of yourself in the process. This battle is magnified exponentially in the hyper-connected modern world. We are constantly monitoring the erosion, checking the glowing social feeds to see what the other version of us, the idealized, curated version of someone else, is achieving. This constant comparison accelerates the feeling of daily loss. You scroll, and the small daily death shifts from a quiet internal compromise to a blinding external measurement. You are measuring the depth of your own stagnation against the advertised, filtered peaks of others' manufactured success. That buzzing phone on the nightstand isn't just a communication device. It is a silent, illuminated ledger tracking the roads you failed to walk today. The only true defense against this perpetual sense of loss is not to try and fight the clock harder. You will always lose that battle, but to fundamentally redefine the meaning of the compromise. Existential maturity lies not in conquering time, but in consciously choosing which parts of the self we allow to die gracefully. The terror is dying without ever realizing what we chose to live for. The ultimate insight arrives when we accept that the small daily death is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. It is the mechanism by which reality demands sacrifices in exchange for definition and forward motion. Every day must end, and something must be left undone, simply for the next day to exist as potential. So you lie there, realizing that the greatest power you possess is not in controlling time, but in consciously selecting the intentional sacrifices you will allow by the time the pillow finally embraces your head. You fight the small daily death not by avoiding it, but by ensuring that every loss was a necessary intentional sacrifice made for a chosen purpose. And tomorrow, the beautiful, inevitable attrition begins again. The active state of absolute rest. The greatest deception of the anxious mind is convincing you that achieving rest requires effort. We call this phenomenon the active state of absolute rest, a time when the pursuit of stillness becomes the primary source of metabolic exertion. It is the paradoxical moment where the highest level of conscious control is exerted in the futile hope of initiating an entirely unconscious process. How many hours have you spent wrestling with the pillow, demanding sleep from a consciousness that only thrives on surrender? Have you noticed that the moment you truly stop trying to sleep is precisely the moment sleep begins to claim you? This space between intention and allowance is where the friction lives. To understand this state, we must first accept that rest is not merely the cessation of movement, but the temporary suspension of executive control. When you command your body to relax, the frontal lobe, the very seat of conscious control, planning, and judgment, is immediately activated. You are trying to use the mechanism of doing to achieve the state of being. Psychologically, this triggers an internal resistance. The mind interprets the command for rest as a complex task requiring planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Am I relaxed yet? Is this working? Why aren't I asleep? This self-monitoring feedback loop is inherently incompatible with the passive acceptance required for genuine rest. The more intensely you desire to stop thinking, the more powerful the mechanism of self-awareness becomes, trapping you in a cycle of metacognition about your own failure to relax. Consider the act of floating. If you enter the water and try with all your might to stay floating, tensing your muscles, trying to push against the water, striving to maintain a rigid posture, you inevitably sink, struggling, expending energy unnecessarily. But if you exhale fully, release the tension in your neck, and simply allow the water to hold you, the density of your body finds its natural equilibrium and buoyancy takes over. Absolute rest is the buoyancy of the mind. You must actively release the anchors of intention and control, not actively pull yourself toward the shore of sleep. The striving effort is the sinker. This is where the core paradox resides, the internal conflict between the willful self and the resting self. The willful self is a tireless administrator, obsessed with efficiency. It sees sleep not as a biological necessity, but as a project to be completed successfully before a deadline. It tries to control the uncontrollable variables: heart rate, peripheral thoughts, the softness of the mattress. It runs diagnostics on the effectiveness of the day, reviewing errors, planning future contingencies, and maximizing productivity even in the dark. But the resting self, the subconscious autonomous system designed for repair and integration, only begins its necessary work when the administrator clocks out and leaves the premises. When you lie down and try to force stillness, you are essentially asking your factory manager to supervise the shutdown process using a bullhorn. The noise of supervision prevents the quiet required for rest. The only action available here is the active disengagement of the supervisor, the deliberate mental action of resignation. You must actively refuse to engage with the thoughts that demand your critical attention, not actively try to crush them. In the modern, always-on ecosystem, we have been conditioned to believe that inactivity is wasted time. We fear the silence because it exposes the underlying anxieties we successfully masked during the day's projects. The waiting room of sleep becomes the stage for existential performance review. We judge our effectiveness based on how quickly we can power down. This cultural pressure transforms the natural requirement for sleep into another item on the to-do list, ensuring the persistence of the active state. Your emotional system is exhausted not by the tasks of the day, but by the relentless, often futile, attempt to control the speed of their processing during the night. The illusion of control ensures you remain active when your system desperately needs you to just be. Recognizing the active state of absolute rest forces a fundamental philosophical recalibration. It is the profound realization that some of the most necessary processes of life, healing, digesting, dreaming, and resting, cannot be commanded. They must be permitted. The moment you acknowledge the illusion of control, the moment you allow the autonomous systems to run without managerial interference, the internal resistance dissolves. This shift is not merely about achieving sleep faster, it is about cultivating a deeper trust in your own biology. A silent agreement that the body knows how to repair itself when the conscious mind steps away from the controls and turns off the lights. The surrender of control is, ironically, the only act of will that works. True rest is not a goal you achieve, but a consequence of letting go of the need for achievement itself. The deepest sleep is found not when you fight for stillness, but when you actively choose to drop the weapon of your own control. You are already floating. Stop swimming. Silence that demands confession. The tyranny of the quiet room is that it removes the audience you've been performing for all day, leaving only the critic you cannot silence. This is the moment where the illusion of control, that neat, stable architecture you constructed from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., finally dissolves, not through external force, but through internal vacuum. You lie there, and the sudden cessation of the day's noise feels less like peace and more like an imminent courtroom session. You are the prosecutor and the defendant, and the verdict is already in. You owe a confession. Why does silence feel heavier than noise? It is because noise allows for diffusion. It is a distraction that justifies perpetual motion. But the deep, enveloping silence just before sleep is an acoustic black hole, pulling all the day's scattered energy inward, amplifying the faint whispers of internal accountability. We call this the confessional echo chamber. This isn't about grand cinematic secrets. It's about the small, foundational lies we tell ourselves to maintain daily stability, the job you despise but rationalize as secure, the relationships you nurture out of habit or obligation, the critical decisions you defer because facing them means dismantling the comfortable familiarity of your current situation. These are the discrepancies between who you are and who you pretend to be. The silence demands you confess these truths not to a priest or a deity, but directly to the architect of your own reality, you. Imagine your mind as a vast, dark administrative building. While you are awake, the lights are on in the lobby, and the staff, your tasks, notifications, and immediate demands are bustling, keeping the surface operations running smoothly. But when you lie down and the main power grid shuts off, your consciousness is forced into the deep sublevels, the archive room. This room is dusty, rarely visited, quiet, and illuminated only by the faint, harsh emergency light of insomnia. Here, every unsorted file, every mistake you promised to address later, every moral inconsistency you swept under the rug glares back at you. They are waiting for their inventory. The central paradox of this nightly reckoning is that we mistake controlling the narrative for controlling reality. We spend our waking hours constructing a perfect, navigable mask tailored for social approval. But sleep is the biological mandate that demands absolute, humiliating surrender. You must drop the mask. And the mind, sensing this unavoidable surrender, fights it by flooding you with the exact material you spent the day suppressing. Your consciousness demands a full, meticulous inventory of the things you failed to act upon, precisely because it knows that in the dark, the cost of denial is cheapest. We fear this internal confession not because the truth is uniquely damning, but because acknowledging it demands a difficult, painful, effortful change that we are not yet ready to commit to when morning comes. The inner critic is less concerned with punishing your past mistakes than it is with ensuring you take action tomorrow. Yet, the energy required to simply acknowledge the truth feels insurmountable at 3 a.m., so you remain suspended, caught between the desire for rest and the mind's refusal to grant amnesty without a formal commitment to honesty. This is the existential debt coming due. The modern life is built on perpetual, intricate noise specifically designed to prevent this silence. The constant obligation to be busy, the endless scroll, the binge-watching schedule, these are highly sophisticated psychological anesthetics against the archive room. When the phone is finally face down and the light is truly out, the engine stalls, and the backlog of psychological debt immediately comes due. This inability to disconnect, this compulsive need to consume content until total exhaustion, is often a subconscious defense mechanism. The silence feels dangerous because the truth feels dangerous. What if the inability to sleep is not a malfunction, but a necessary, primal function? It is the soul's audit. It is the biological mechanism ensuring that you cannot coast forever on false assumptions, that the self you abandon must eventually be retrieved. The mind creates the silence and then uses that very silence as the perfect echo chamber to amplify the truths you must hear before you can genuinely rest. Rest is earned by acknowledgement, not by avoidance. You cannot sleep soundly on a foundation of lies, even if they are lies you told only to yourself. The confession isn't meant to punish you. It's meant to free the self you put on hold. And sometimes the most profoundly honest thing you can whisper into the echoing darkness of your bedroom is the simple, terrifying, liberating truth. I know exactly what I am avoiding. If you reach this far, you're one of the few who stayed conscious until the end. Write "I know the secret" in the comments and share this reflection forward.